This is Michael Matheson Miller, and you are listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. Thank you again for listening to the Moral Imagination Podcast. My guest today is Titus Techera. He's a writer and film critic, and we're going to talk about the film Dune and the film Bladerunner, and of course the book Dune as well. We discuss science fiction, techno-utopianism, dystopia, and American life. And some of the tensions in science fiction. In one sense, it's a prophetic look at what could be if we continue down a certain path. Titus argues that science fiction set in the near future and Blade Runner is an attempt to make us look at ourselves as though we were strangers to ourselves. And this allows for the possibility that serious change can come suddenly and overcome our beliefs. We see a tension then in science fiction between despair and a dystopian view, and then also the power of human agency and hope. And often it's not transhumanism or technology that saves the day, but in fact it is a human being and with love and sacrifice. So some of the themes we discuss include science and scientism, atheism and religion, nihilism versus a utopian vision, social engineering, and really what it means to be a human being. We also discuss the work of Jordan Peterson and some of the new Stoics and their appeal to young men. And also just kind of this tension between Stoicism and utilitarianism and hedonism. I think one of the things that's interesting in the discussion is that Titus brings a European perspective, especially to the questions of sports and manliness and science. And so I think you'll find it interesting. And he's a very provocative thinker. And so I hope you enjoy our discussion. So Titus is the executive director of the American Cinema Foundation. He is the host of ACF podcast. He is a film critic for Law and Liberty and the Acton Institute, and a contributor to Modern Age, a columnist for Return and the European Conservative, and the editor-in-chief of Postmodern Conservative. He studied liberal arts at Bard College in Berlin and political science at the University of Bucharest. I'm delighted to have Titus back on the podcast. We had a podcast before with Flag Taylor where we discussed communism and film. So you can listen to that as well. Before we get to the interview, thank you again to all of those of you who have supported me on Patreon. I very much appreciate it. And thanks to all of those who have written a review. If you do like the podcast, please go to Apple Podcast and give it a 5-star review. Thanks also to all of you who have subscribed. If you have not heard, I have a newsletter that I'm going to send out about twice a month, where I'll have some links to recent podcasts, but also a shorter essay or reflection on a topic. So the last one was on the social nature of the person, and then some links to some of the books that I'm reading. So you can subscribe to that and get all the show notes for this episode and all the other episodes at themoralimagination.com. So thank you very much for listening, and I hope you enjoy my conversation with Titus Techera. Titus, thank you very much for joining the podcast.
Hello, Michael. Thank you for the invitation to come back. I'm very pleased to be talking with you again. It's the sort of conversation we have among friends because it's not in itself also pleasant. These are indeed quite troubling subjects. We look to the fearful possibility that we are losing our humanity or maybe even giving it away. Somehow these technological systems seem more and more daunting, and our ability to grasp them with the mind or politically in action seems more remote or more confused. Not very happy times, but a very necessary thing to contemplate, and in a way the perfect sequel to our communism podcast. That was an ideological and technological tyranny, but in Europe. And now we're looking at America and the future rather than the past, and the possibility of something similar and yet different, distinctly American, perhaps, might come to pass here as well. That's as scary.
You know, I think that's an interesting point because I was thinking about this in a lecture I gave a while ago. What did the 20th century tyranny look like? And then what does 21st century threat look like, right? It's a very different thing. I mean, aligned in the sense that it's connected to science and progress and kind of creating a utopian future, because I don't think we lost that. That utopian dream in one sense still remains, but it's also almost a shift from this kind of very muscular atheism and creating the Tower of Babel that, influenced by Feuerbach and Marx. We've left God behind. We're going to build this powerful kingdom and we're going to solve the problems of evil, sin, suffering, and death through politics. And then the political regimes failed. They gave us death, destruction, tyranny,
right? Despair. And yet, there's this leftover, but it's a shift into a technocratic scientific solution. And so there's a mixture, I think, in modern life between despair, like kind of a nihilism knocking on our door, and then also this kind of scientific hope in progress that, well, politics failed us, but science and rationalism still can succeed. So it's almost like a decadence plus a scientific utopianism. What do you think about that? You think that's correct, or?
Yeah, I think that's a very astute point where our fear of tyranny is somehow not really political. It's not like the confrontation between ideologies or empires or great powers. And indeed, it doesn't seem exactly to be exterior to us. It's not an enemy that comes from somewhere else. And that is a great sign of decadence, that we're afraid of ourselves. Maybe something has grown inside of our way of life. Maybe something has happened to our habits and our beliefs, our principles, or our institutions in society or the economy or in indeed academia and science especially, that's turning us into something we don't really recognize.
So maybe we'll go back into that, but let's start. We've already kind of maybe gone a little too philosophical in the beginning of our film discussion, but let's actually talk about it. I mean, you watch film in a way that I find actually very helpful. Sometimes I just watch the movie and think, is it good? Is it bad? Do I like it or not? How corrupting is this for my soul and the soul of my children? And that's about kind of my basics there. But you take film into you really analyze it in light of philosophy of political science, of poetry as a reflection of almost like a prophetic way. Let's talk about Dune first. And to very quite good reviews, you have some critiques of it. Now, so I have to say, I saw Dune around, okay? And I have so much to read. I was like, I'm never going to read Dune, okay? And then I think it was right before I came down with COVID. A colleague had lent me the book, a big, huge book. And I said, I'll see what does this have to say to me? So I read the first like 15 pages or 20 pages, and it's gripping. Like it gets you right away. And so I gave it to my wife. I'm like, read this. And so she read the first 13 pages. She actually got ahead. But I read the entire book, and I've seen the movie. But I haven't seen the first movie. I've seen the trailer, so I know about the aesthetics. But I'd like to talk about Dune, the ideas behind Dune, and then the way, as you've written, it gets manifested both in David Lynch's film and in the new film.
Yeah, it was a very successful novel. It's the kind of novel whose success the publishing houses didn't see coming. It was famously rejected maybe dozens of times before somebody finally took a chance on it. And then it became one of the big hits of the 60s. And here we are now. It has quite some staying power to still be such a draw. This new 2021 movie was incredibly expensive movie. Probably the costs in all went over $200 million. You wouldn't expect a science fiction story to have that much attraction or take 2 generations after its launch. But it's easy to underestimate to what extent science fiction had a formational power over generations of Americans. And so what was maybe unbelievable at the time, people didn't even think, people would read such a thing. It's not for adults in a certain sense. It seemed like childish fantasy.
Right.
Since then, it has become the norm. And in certain ways, I guess it's because it has influenced the young, but in another way, because as science fiction has often done, it predicted, sometimes with disturbing enthusiasm, how dependent we will be on science, on technology, how it will affect our way of life at every level. Our grandparents, at least, used to think that technology is something you use and use it now and then, maybe especially for work. But it wouldn't really come into your life or your inner life. It wouldn't really come into your house or in your family. Well, obviously, all that's done. Now it is everywhere. So I think that's how come Dune still has this great staying power. And I agree with you. There's something gripping to it because unlike much of science fiction, it is very concerned with character and with the deep desires of the human heart that turn towards religion. Obviously, science fiction tends to be an atheist genre. Not always the case. There is even Catholic science fiction or other kinds of science fiction that's obviously religious. But usually it's atheist, and it assumes, as you were saying, about the 19th and 20th centuries, that religion is going away. Religion is some delusion from mankind's past, or perhaps a helpful delusion from mankind's past, but it's over. And that kind of science fiction has not survived so well. This one is much more potent because it takes serious the deep yearnings of the heart. And so it tells the story of this young man, Paul Atreides, who becomes a prophet and a ruler. So there's a kind of medieval setting for the story, as science fiction often likes to use, because it's so glamorous, legendary, and because in the beauty of the medieval age, it finds scope for great dreams of new powers that were unimaginable perhaps to medieval rulers. So that you could say that in a way, Frank Herbert simply takes the story of Muhammad and says, what if it's all true? What if this guy's a prophet and he has therefore these superhuman powers? And so that's why the Arabs destroyed and conquered the Persian Empire and made this entirely new fanatical empire that's ruled by a religion, which the Persian Empire had not been. But of course this doesn't mean that Frank Herbert was anything but a liberal atheist. It's just that he was sympathetic to this idea that prophets have special powers, and that human beings especially look to the oracular powers of prophets in order to take control of time, to take control of the future, to make sure that, as people would say today, they're on the right side of history. Mm-hmm. So that's the Dune story. What if a prophet out of the desert should come with a savage warrior people and then take on a highly sophisticated but incredibly corrupt empire?
I think another thing about the Dune book that is not manifested in the newest movie, and there's a lot of interiority, there's a lot of discussion, there's a lot of like the thought of the character. And I remember my wife said, like, how are they going to do that? And they didn't really do it. They were able to get a little bit of it out. But I think there's something about the interior. There's a scene, there's like a dining room scene, I don't know if you remember that in the book, where Jessica is kind of looking at all the interiority of everyone kind of conniving for power and how she sees her, Paul, her son, in the midst of this. So I think that was another fascinating element of the book that I think goes maybe to your connection of religion, that there's the interiority of the person is quite profound in the book, which is a little bit different from a scientific or scientistic way of seeing the person as merely a type of machine. And so there's, I think, a tension because you have, right, in Dune, you have the Mentats, you have the warriors, you have these transhumanist Harkonnens, right, who have all these different like technological elements to them. And then you have the interior humanity that's inescapable that I think is going on. I don't think the film got that as much, but the book did.
Yeah, of course. Interior dialogue, interior monologue is very hard to translate to cinema. It's a notorious problem, and people have a prejudice against voiceovers, as they're called, or this sort of interior monologue that's typical of the novel. The movies are much more public in a certain sense, since after all, it's all of us in a theater looking at the stuff, whereas the novels were much more private. One would read one to oneself silently at that. It's much more private. And of course, it's much more about the private lives of people, about some exploration of the self or soul. And Dune does employ much more than most science fiction, this device of the interior monologue to get us into the characters' heads and show us how the world looks like from inside of them. And that's something that David Lynch, for the 84 movie, simply translated visually, since the aesthetic is so definite it's so beautifully medieval and strange space age ideas. It's some kind of confrontation of innocence and incredibly powerful dangers. One is reminded almost of the Henry James phrase, the virgin and the dynamo, medieval faith versus modern technology. You see that all over the David Lynch movie. And so as an aid to humanism, he simply has the characters whisper, so to speak, to themselves, which creates this added element of interiority that people feel that somehow they are in danger. Mm-hmm. They are talking to themselves in whispers. They know that they need to hide in a certain way. The new movie doesn't do much of that. Instead, it tries to convey the moods visually through the suffering. The actors act half the time like they're suffering. Mm-hmm. And if you know the story, it makes a lot more sense that these people are under terrible pressure. But if you don't know the story in advance, I think there's something quite ridiculous to it. And of course, it's just a very serious problem. people might be whining or moaning or complaining. They might be pensive. They might be listless. They might seem like they're crying or about to, but you don't know why. You don't know the reason for it. You don't know their own reasons or their own self-understanding, whereas the novel does give you that. And so, yes, it is quite difficult for the new movie to give this aid to our reasoning humanity through speech, at least to ourselves. It tries to lean much more on emotions and on mood as determining how you look at things, and try to use the cinematic, mimetic power of cinema. Look at these characters, see what they're feeling, and then maybe it'll make you feel the same way. It might convey this mood of brooding, darkening danger.
Mm-hmm. I definitely, in a sense, got more out of the film because I had read the book. And so I knew, like, there's so many things that if you didn't read the book, you don't know. It's just kind of like, oh, that was interesting. If you read the book, you know all the things that are going on behind that. And in fact, even the treachery is already known early in the book, right? Through the little epitaphs at the beginning of the chapter. So there's a kind of that sense of tension. But let's move into this. You made a couple of comments I'd like to maybe go through, and then we can keep going back between the book and the movie, and both of the movies. But there is a sense of foreboding. Well, let's start this way. Why? You've touched on it a bit. Do you think science fiction has so much formative power? In a sense, you're right. Science fiction is kind of like a very side genre, kind of connected somewhat to fantasy, but maybe thought of as for children. And then it has predictive power. But now, if you think about some of our most important entrepreneurs or leaders, they're shaped by these books like, Asimov's Foundation or Dune or I, Robot, or I'm trying to think, I'm actually just in the beginning of Snow Crash by Stephenson, right? And you think these things at one side are, they're just the fantasies of children. But now the children are adults and the adults are running things. And this shapes their worldview quite profoundly. And I'm actually worried about it because I think it's a disordered worldview. I think it's a technocratic view of humanity that's not only disordered, but incoherent, and ultimately like a last-ditch attempt at trying to fight the nihilism that comes from this kind of utopian technocracy. I mean, there's a lot of big words together, but let me say that. What I mean is there's, again, like I said earlier, if we could just solve the problems of man through science, through genetic manipulation, through technology, through metaverse, through escape, it's in a sense a new iteration of the atheistic 19th, 20th century. That's kind of how I see it. And yet there is something both human about it, because in a sense, transhumanism always fails. It doesn't really work. It ends up creating more problems than it does. Like in genetics, you'd say there are off-target effects, right? You thought you were going to solve one problem, but you cascade into others. Can you talk about maybe the genre and film? And don't be limited to Dune or to Blade Runner or whatever. You can talk about it broadly, but what are these films getting at, and why are they so capturing of the modern imagination?
I think you're right that there is a great part of the attraction of science fiction has to do with this distinctively modern pathos, this sense that it's now or never, it's do or die. We either assume enormous global cosmic powers, or we're going to be rendered extinct. These very famous series of stories, The Foundation of Isaac Asimov, or the Dune stories of Frank Herbert, or any number of others, Stephenson is not an exception here. They suggest mankind is perched somehow between greatness and extinction. Ordinary life is over. Ordinary experience doesn't really count. We have to learn to assume these new powers and transform ourselves in the world, or it's over. And when you hear Elon Musk talk about going to Mars, you see that immediately, that mankind must become a multiplanetary species in order to avoid the darkness of the universe. An asteroid might come out of nowhere and it's over for us. That view of the cosmos, the view of modern science, of a peculiarly materialistic science, suggests that there is really no hope and there's no providence. And this universe is, once you come to understand it, very unwelcoming. Extinction always is around the corner. Hence the popularity of things like, the the extinction of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs once dominated the planet, and look what happened to them. We're just smarter dinosaurs, and it's going to happen to us too. Mankind is absolutely unprotected, and that must summon the greatest powers that science can give us in order to protect ourselves. And maybe that requires that we transform our very humanity. After all, why are we unprotected? We are unprotected because we believe in humanity, and to believe in humanity is to believe that there's some kind of divine cosmic support for humanity. Modern science reveals nihilism. There is no support, nothing, no good coming. And we got lucky so far, but it's madness to push our luck. We have to turn into something post-human because it's the only way to survive. Our humanity is just a delusion, and we have come of age. We have to shed that delusion. So it's very much the teaching of 19th century positivism that leads to this nihilism, that in previous ages of mankind, people believed in religion or philosophy because they were stupid. That stupidity is understandable from an evolutionary point of view, but it's now inexcusable. Now we can do better. Now we can be positivist scientists and therefore take power over ourselves. No longer believe in things, but to do things. Experiment on ourselves, experiment on our planet, experiment on the cosmos if we have the chance. We should have the chance. We should do it. And so there's a kind of heroism here. It's sometimes a very manly nihilism that says we can conquer planets. We can go beyond this world and beyond other worlds too. We have so much that we can do. There's something manly, adventurous, daring about it. And it stems from this awareness that we have lived in so many different ways of life, and they have changed. So we can change them intentionally. We don't have to wait for an empire to collapse, like in Dune or in The Foundation. We can take it on our own. We can make it on our own. We can take it in our own hands to transform our way of life. The empire doesn't have to collapse. We can transform it ourselves. And if we don't, there's always the specter of extinction. Mm-hmm. It's either win it all or lose it all. And so you see with this manly nihilism also this desperation. Sometimes it's daring, sometimes it's despairing. It's what in the vulgar language people call a manic depressive or a bipolar attitude, or a love-hate relationship with the universe at that. Mm-hmm. In this universe, we can have through scientific experimentation all this power, for example, nuclear power. But if you look at it, it's also quite dangerous to us. And the universe is itself quite dangerous to us. So that, I believe, is the core of science fiction pathos. And I think it's a distinctly American version of this European problem of nihilism from the 19th century, of progress and despair, because it's so much more individualistic. It's so much more about the can-do attitude, about entrepreneurship, much less involved in state institutions, much less involved in these kinds of developments that are very large level, but don't really seem to be available to human choice or action. Progress doesn't have heroes as such. In America, progress has heroes. So that would be the difference. But of course, that also means that the despair hits harder for whoever has these exalted expectations, only to realize that they are not, in fact, able to deal with this. And so you can see with one powerful engine for science fiction, fantasizing for science fiction stories, is disappointment with the world. We have to escape to another planet because this one won't work. Right. The dead hand of the past is just too strong. There are all these things from the past, traditions that get in the way of radical innovation. Science fiction is all too aware of the problem of our decadence, but thinks that it can be solved through more technical daring. There's a manly component to it, so that's got to be human. And there's a technical component to it, so that's something you can believe in, because what do people believe in? Science. It's what studies show.
Right. So I think there's a number of things that come. I think one distinction you made early on, which I think is really important, is we're facing one of two options, either extinction and destruction, right? Or, how did you articulate it? Or this kind of greatness of a new, completely redefined life that we're going to build through science and technology. And those are our two options. And so ordinary life is boring. Ordinary life is unsatisfying, and there's nothing there. And I think one of the things, without getting too immediately relevant, I think we see this, you talked about belief. There's this Tower of Babel ethos, which I've talked about on the podcast before, it's really an articulation to understanding like this desire for man to make a name for ourselves, right? And so there's a question like, does God give you the name? And then do you participate in creation? Because being is good, but it's messed up. And being is good. The world is not made out of dragon's flesh. Human beings are not the result of a demiurge. But the fall happened and there's a brokenness. And that requires redemption from the outside, from God, who ultimately can redeem us, but that we're supposed to participate in that redemptive work, right? And so we're supposed to participate in the creative work of completing creation, of invention, of technology, of development. But it's also this affirmation of being and the goodness of ordinary life, right? And then when you lose that, in a sense, that sense of covenant, then man is all alone. A friend of mine, Rabbi Mitch Rockland, who I hope is going to come on the podcast soon, he makes this point, I think, really well. He said, if there's no covenant, then man's alone. You've got to do it by yourself. So that the kind of sense of despair versus greatness, extinction versus greatness is understandable in that sense. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing that struck me is you see this idea with science, right? That, again, I'm bringing you back what I said in the beginning, politics, which is a technological, in a sense, solution. Politics was going to solve the problem of man in the 20th century. But now it's not. It's science. It's genetic therapy. It's creating super soldiers. It's solving the problems of blindness. And I actually wonder if this is perhaps one of the many, many reasons, right? Why the passion around COVID, the pandemic, the vaccine is so heated. Because in a sense, for certain people, especially for like elite technocrats, science must work. If science does not work, then this is, in a sense, a turning back. It's the failure of the 20th century politics now is the failure of 21st century science. We can't have that. We have to move forward. And there's this, I think, deep devotion and belief. And one could say, and I mean this not in a pejorative way, although I'm probably pejorative against it, but I mean it in a more technical way. There's an idolatry of science. Science and the technical way to solve the problem of man must be believed in, because if that's not there, politics has failed us, man has failed us, ordinary life has failed us, and now nihilism is knocking on our door. What do you think?
Oh, yeah, I have no hesitation about saying this. These people are all fanatics. And you can tell this, I think, in a scientific way. That is, were they not fanatics, they would say, clearly, look around the world, much doesn't work. People are very unhappy. There's all sorts of trouble. So whatever it is that we've been doing hasn't worked out as advertised. And so it's time to re-examine what we were promised. And maybe it's time to re-examine what we're hoping for and why. Maybe it's time to re-examine ourselves as human beings in a radical way. That is to say, to go to the root, not radical in the political sense of the famous Leninist saying, we will, after all these purges, we will have fewer but better Russians, kill a few million people and the other ones will be better. Not that kind of political radicalism. And of course, not technological radicalism that says we'll be better with more devices implanted in us. Radical in the sense of exposing the roots or going back to the origins of humanity. As you were saying, think about the origins of humanity as taught in Genesis. That perhaps the scientists have a better idea, but we would like to see the confrontation in its fullness. And we don't ever see that. We do not see that our fans of science fiction, right? Science fiction today is broadcasted by state media, by international organizations. Science fiction is broadcast by tech corporations. It's the most popular fantasy left, or at any rate, it's the authoritative fantasy. The science is working, must work. Science fiction is now our reality, our propaganda. And that's dangerous, but it also reveals this. This is fanaticism. These are not people who have examined human nature in the most competent way. They're people who don't even think of making the attempt. That's in itself a very dangerous thing. The fact that these people cannot second-guess themselves or allow themselves to be second-guessed, that they can conceive of no alternatives. Again, that comes from this mentality that we either win everything or it's extinction. It's us or it's over. There are no alternatives. There is no going back, certainly, and there are no alternatives. So that's it's a desperation, and it only further feeds fanaticism. We must succeed, right? I mean, There has not been any blaming, for example, of elites in any part of the world, which they should do. They should face blame. If COVID is some kind of natural catastrophe, then it proves that all these people with their science have failed. They should be held accountable. Supposedly, they were the masters of all these organizations, all these institutions, national, international, transnational. They were supposed to be very successful. They were supposed to be a meritocracy. And yet their failure does not cause them to say sorry, much less go home and let somebody else do the job. Instead, it's saying, well, no, we have to blame the past. There are people with attitudes that come from the past. There are people who have obsolete thoughts, that are misinformation, that they're dangerous. Those people are the problem. We have come to this ridiculous situation where the governors blame the governed, where we are told that the vaccinated are afraid of the unvaccinated because the unvaccinated are dangerous to the people who, being vaccinated, are protected. The vulnerable are dangerous to the protected. The unvaccinated, dangerous to the vaccinated. This is psychopathic talk, but it has become not only common among liberal elites, but authoritative. One hears the President of the United States say this in public. And of course, nobody expects Mr. Biden to say half intelligent things, but something like the protected are afraid of the unprotected. Even children could think that this is crazy talk. How could this be? If science gives you all this power and protection, why are you so scared of the people who don't have it and who are powerless comparatively? How could the government, with all their authority that is scientific, right? All these politicians say, follow the science, we must follow the science. And yet it's not working.
Mm-hmm. Or when you find out, for example, that the vaccine does not stop transmission, as was said, then a new rhetorical device is used, right? So there's always a shifting in the rhetorical devices constantly, because it's an interesting thing, because science is supposed to be this empirical thing. And at the same time, it's something that we have to control back and forth. So what do you think about that? Think that's right, wrong?
Yeah, that's the double role of science, right? On the one hand, science proves things. On the other hand, if you don't believe them, you have to be censored. That is to say, in another sense, science is something of a political power that depends on rhetoric and on police enforcement. So this double character of science has gradually revealed to people that our science is science fiction. It's a kind of propaganda run by elites, and nobody really believes in it. This is why people don't really blame themselves for their failures. They don't think that science can really fix these problems, except for the people who maybe are afraid that science created this problem in the first place. What if this COVID disease, this one comes from a lab in Wuhan, not from, Mother Nature? What if we made it? That would be even worse in a certain sense. So, are men powerful enough to create these things and so incompetent that it becomes a global pandemic? Or are men so weak and incompetent that the global pandemic came without human power and is sweeping over the world and ruining lives, economies, geopolitics, everything? Either way, it's a catastrophe for the fanatics of science. Yeah. And so they're blaming everybody else. They're blaming ordinary people. They're blaming the small minority who is as yet unvaccinated. And that hysterical and mad reaction shows that science fiction as propaganda is failing. This is another reason why people are saying, no, we need science fiction to be something more radical than propaganda, maybe something transhuman. Propaganda, after all, is human. It's based on the human opinion that human beings can be persuaded, lied to even, manipulated in their views. But that's a human problem. How about we have to go beyond human problems and have something transhuman, something technological? This world is a world with epidemics and incompetent institutions. Maybe the next world is not heaven, but the metaverse. Maybe that will be better.
Yeah, it's an escape. I actually have this thought. I haven't developed it very deeply, but I thought about this before. When you think about, say, for example, science and the attachment to it, I think you see a similar thing with climate change. So, for example, there's a question of if climate change is not mostly caused by human beings, that's actually worse than if it is caused by human beings. Because if it's caused by human beings, we can solve the problem. But if in fact climate, and whether it's a problem or not is a debate I'm not getting into, but if climate change is in fact something that we don't have total control over, again, it's, I think, a parallel to your point. Like if the COVID virus is natural, that's a horrible thing. And if the COVID virus is lab developed, that's a horrible thing, because both of them go to the question of, can we control science or can we control nature? One other thing that's kind of interesting that you pointed out, and then I want to go back and develop a little bit more some of the points you've made. But the other thing that's kind of interesting is again, this I'll call it an incoherence, but it's also a tension or incoherence between the hero who has to solve our problems, like the American entrepreneur science hero who has to solve our problems, and a certain kind of despair that comes from Darwinian random evolution. We have no control. We're just part of nature. There's no real free will. So among some of the kind of like leading scientific, like neurological determinism, biological determinism, Sam Harris says you could not choose otherwise, right? Yuval Harari, death is just a glitch we have to fix, right? All these things, if you start to like put them all together in this picture, there's two real things going on. We have to be heroes to get away from our humanity, which is broken, to become post-human and transhuman. And yet we have no agency. We have no power because we're just simply the products of random biological evolution. So notice I always get a kick out of the expression like, we are going to control evolution. Well, how is that possible? Right? It's not possible. And so in a sense, and this, I'd like to ask you a question. In a sense, our whole language, the normal language of kind of the dominant ways in which we speak, are deeply incoherent at their core. And we're supposed to hold in tension two or three things that don't mix. And if you bring them out, then somehow you're a anti-science, you're a radical, you're retrograde, whatever it might be. And so in a sense, I think you said this, our science is science fiction. Our science is propaganda. So maybe could you develop that a little bit? Like, what do you mean? And maybe I misunderstood you, but what do you mean when you say our science is propaganda? Our science is science fiction. Does it connect it to what I just brought out? Or are you saying something different or what?
Yes, they're very much connected. We have very few, first of all, real theoreticians. Just looking at things at the most vulgar calculating level. Throughout the 20th century, the number of people with PhDs, the number of institutes, the number of grants, the money involved in science, the political prestige of science, we have put unprecedented numbers of people and unprecedented sums of money for unprecedented periods of time into scientific discoveries. We do not have one genius to show for it. There's a reason people still talk about Einstein or Hawking, which gets you to the at least past the mid-century. This should worry people. If they really cared about science, they would say, well, two possibilities arise. One of them is that, like in the past, we need another Einstein, and then we should suspect we're too incompetent in the way we do things because we haven't produced one. Or we could say, well, we have produced a new way of doing science that doesn't depend on a new Einstein or a new Hawking or a new Feynman or individuals like that. We don't need scientific heroes anymore. We're going to do it institutionally in some way. And then you would have to point out the institution that is producing what it used to take an Einstein or a Planck or a Bohr to produce. And we don't have either, and we don't care about either, which I think is very good proof that our science is a series of political institutions that is, first of all, busy lying about how incompetent it is. These people do not have theoretical capacities themselves and are not looking for anybody with theoretical capacity, at least at the level of an Einstein. This would be very worrisome stuff if we were serious about what we want out of science. If there's supposed to be progress, it either has to come by another genius or by some kind of institution that produces results perhaps at an even greater level by avoiding the limits of one human being. And we don't have either. And that's not just a shame. That's not just proof that these people have failed. It's a suggestion as to why they've gone mad. They're supposedly in the business of scientific progress, and they do not have any way of doing it. Yet they have to pretend every day. That's not an easy way to live when you have to pretend all the time.
Give some examples, Titus. Somebody might be listening to you and say, what are you talking about? We've done incredible technological developments. We have longer lifespans. Lifespans have actually flattened out over the last 30 years, in fact, which is an important question, I think, which is also creating a little bit of despair in people as well.
People who are alive today live almost exactly like their parents did 50 years ago, with the exception of smartphones. Now, computers are, of course, something impressive and new, and the penetration of smartphones on the planet is something we will have to reckon with. It's transforming every aspect of society, starting with how we educate 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds who have tablets in front of their faces. So I'm not playing that down. But that's not a scientific revolution. That's based on the scientific revolution of, most importantly, quantum studies, but to some extent to relativistic studies as well. This is not a new science compared to that of the early 20th century. It is just that science applied. And it is not the job of theoretical physicists to create a smartphone. It's the job of the Steve Jobses of the world to do that. And even with that, I mean, surely the smartphone is an impressive thing, but it is not what it was advertised to be, right? From Silicon Valley to the rest of the elite, people are terrified that social media, the smartphone, access to information is creating madness. They're not proud of what they've done in this sense. They don't think it worked according to plan and it's obviously good. And many of them are, to some extent, hated. So even at the level of technical advance, rather than the level of theoretical scientific advance, there is very much to be skeptical of. Is anybody happy for being on social media? Are people with smartphones in their pockets an advanced form of human being? They don't seem like it. They don't seem like it to themselves. People do not go on social media to brag about how happy they are. They go there to complain about how insane they are and their traumas and their mental health issues and so on and so forth. And how, well, of course, they always blame somebody for it. It's somebody's political fault. But this is not the behavior of a new race of advanced beings. This is the behavior of decadent, aging people. It's not obvious that the metaverse is anything but a distraction from science or from technology at that. And these are the kinds of concerns that animate movies like Dune and Bladerunner and so forth. Bladerunner predicted our society, right? It's set in California, in LA, and you have these glittering techno-creations of the scientific corporate elite, not just gadgets, but buildings like I guess it would be the Apple Ring. But these people have pyramids in Bladerunner because it's more telling, reminds us of our Egyptian slavery. And what is life like in Los Angeles, aside from this elite that flies around? Well, they live in slums. It's miserable, it's dark, and it's exactly like life is in many parts of San Francisco or even Los Angeles. Basic functions of administration and the self-respect of ordinary life are being endangered, and in some cases or some parts of the city is wiped out. It was remarkably prophetic about how techno-scientific power at the top, whatever its achievements, would somehow destroy even basic administration or self-government in the cities around there. And this seemed crazy at the time. It was the 80s and then the 90s. America was getting rich. Crime was going down pretty quickly in the 90s. And look where we are now. Turns out that it was right and we were wrong to be so blithely optimistic. So these movies show you that what if people come to hate the fact that they're human? What if their experience of daily life is going to be so depressive, it begins to be like, what is the atmosphere in Blade Runner? It's the atmosphere every day on Twitter. It's the exact same. So it was quite prophetic. Mind you, Blade Runner was not a successful movie. I'm not sure it even made its money back in the 82 when it came out. It became what is called a cult hit. You can't blame, Ridley Scott for ruining society. He just showed, this was going to be like. There's a strand of science fiction that's quite dystopian that suggested that this would be a big problem that comes at least from the 60s when, of course, cities started burning and liberalism turned out not to be so in control of people's hearts and minds or of their actions. Life might turn out to be less progressive and much, much darker and destructive. So you see our realities and our mood in movies like Blade Runner, and they're quite scary. It's just that being artistically presented, they are much clearer. There is not the distraction of our ordinary beliefs, hopes, compromises, the urgency of getting this done or waiting on somebody to do that other thing that distracts you from seeing clearly that we might be giving up our freedom and our humanity to a techno-despotism, which is the problem of Blade Runner.
Right. Let's talk about that a little bit. There's a couple of things I would like to go into. One, maybe briefly, because you've talked about this a lot of other people. Well, if somebody says, well, we're giving up our human freedom to technology, what would be just 3 things right away that you see? And of course, I'm sympathetic to this. So I wrote a little book called Digital Contagion, where I think there are many benefits of technology. I love running water and pens and pencils. And this is great that we are able to have this conversation over digital video and audio. But it's a danger. Okay. So what would you say? So my first, a brief question, if someone's listening to you, like, okay, what do you mean? That's a big statement, Titus. Like we're giving up our humanity. I mean, just give me like 3 quick things. And then I want to go into a layer of some other questions.
Well, I would like to start from people's everyday experience, from the obvious. This is where philosophical thinking begins. What is it like being human for us? One thing is obviously this ubiquity of smartphones that is making people unhappy.
Yep.
I'm not saying that smartphones cause some terrible trouble that we're going to legislate or we're going to have a lawsuit against it and blame some corporation and take their money in a big payoff day like people used to have lawsuits against big tobacco or big oil or whatever. I don't mean something that dramatic or limited. Mm-hmm. I mean that people constantly say that they can't really get away from their smartphones. Mm-hmm. And people just say that. And when people hear that, they say, yep, that's the way it is. It has become part of ordinary life, however alien this computer really is. And that suggests that these people are no longer free. And they feel it, but they don't know what to do about it. And what's worse, they don't know if they should do anything about it. People who complain about their smartphones or what they do on their smartphones are not sure that this is bad because they have no idea what might it be that's good. If I give this up, what am I going to have except the emptiness of my own life?
Right.
And you can look at something that would be obvious, that is to say it's a massive social phenomenon, but that we all lie about. Elites lie about it out of propaganda needs. The rest of us lie about it because it makes us feel bad. We don't have a society anymore. Our young people have failed to mate. Most Americans at the age of 30 are not married. Right. Or if we're supposed to live in some new progressive hippie 60s utopia, they should have their communes, or maybe they should have some weird arrangements between male and female, male and male, male and whatever, and they should be kind of pleased with that if this new revolutionary world is real. Neither exists. Not the old world where everybody had to be traditional, you had to marry. There were always shotgun marriages. And it was a necessity of life. Just to read a lovely Jane Austen novel like Pride and Prejudice, and you will see that some of those marriages are happy, even blessed it seems, and some of them are unhappy marriages because people made stupid choices, and some of them are punishments because people have done things that are almost illegal. And all of that is necessary to make up a society. It can't be perfect, not even in a Jane Austen novel. Well, now, Jane Austen is impossible to explain to people if they've gotten to 30 and they know that they're unmarriageable. Right. Marriage is not really a demand for them. But what does it mean? Like these people are 22 or 30. They're just the kids of somebody and somebody else and everybody else. They're the kids of society. If society existed, they would be mated by now. In the traditional way, in some revolutionary way, something, but not lonely, unhappy people. Yeah. Society doesn't exist. That's why people are online. Why are people on their smartphones? Because society doesn't exist. The mark of society is that the adults take care that the young mate somehow, because there is something that not all the technology in our world and not all the politics or ideology can fix, making babies. Right. There's only one way that happens. And as a society, we failed to do it, and we don't even talk about it. We hide from the fact that we don't have a society, and we hide from the fact that our youth are savages, but they have smartphones. But it's not the fault of the kids, it's the fault of the adults who raised them that way. It's the fault of the elites that manage this kind of society and are kind of proud of themselves. This is what it means for people to have a smartphone that they cannot get rid of. This is what it means to look at the obvious without lying, without being ashamed of ourselves, and without being stupid. Just see the obvious in a person's experience and see the obvious in American society. It is not some kind of government secret at the CIA that most people at 30 are unmarried. It's easily known, but nobody knows it. Publicly, we hide from the knowledge, just like publicly, we don't know. What should we be doing with these smartphones? What would be a good use of them? When is it that we've lost our freedom and are giving up our humanity? That is to say, we no longer know, is our freedom good for us, and to what would it lead us that's good for us? We're just stuck with the way things are. That means that we are no longer exactly human. If we were human, then this technology, a smartphone, would be to some extent a matter of choice and directed towards a purpose. We all do stuff for reasons. If you ask your kid why he did something stupid, he will give you a reason, which at least seems to him pretty good. He might be wrong, he might be corrected, but for him to be wrong and corrected already assumes that he had a purpose to do what he did. But we do not feel we have a purpose in living as we do. We feel that we are stuck with it. we feel that life is living us, so to speak, or the technology is using us rather than us it.
Yeah.
That widespread feeling is the abandonment of humanity. And that's what you see in all these sci-fi movies that are quite, as we say, dystopian, very unhappy tyrannies.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up a couple of very important things about the purpose of life. I think I'm not sure, maybe it's James Poulo. Somebody says are we holding our phone as our phone holding us? And there's this question of being a cyborg, right? In a sense, we think of a cyborg as something that's science fiction, but in a sense, if we're completely and constantly attached to technology, our humanity has become technified. 2 points I'd like to just follow up on, then I want to go back to some of your earlier comments. I think you said something I've been thinking about quite a bit. And I think it's connected to transhumanism, and I think it's connected to decadence, is we have seen, I would argue, a failure of adults to do what adults should do, which is, I like how you articulate, there's no society. And why is there no society? There's no society because adults aren't living like adults. What are adults supposed to do? Adults are supposed to help young people walk through the normal vicissitudes of their life, the ups and downs. They're vulnerable, they're emotionally weak, they're foolish, and walk through all these complexities and get them to the place where they can flourish. Okay, so what do you need to flourish? Right. Well, what does everybody want? Basically, you want a spouse who you love, who loves you, who's faithful, and that you can have babies with. 2, you want a friend. Friends that have your back, right? And then 3, if you can do some meaningful work, that's great. But it doesn't even that much matter, because if you have the spouse and the friends, then you have a society, and then your work, in a sense, is to serve that. Instead, what have adults done? Adults have taken, say, vulnerable children. We see this especially, like the exemplar, of course, is like transgenderism and all the kind of disordered sexuality that's out there. I think I heard a report, I could be wrong on this, that like 15 or 20% of Generation Z children identify as somehow on this LGBTQ spectrum. Okay. Now we know that's not possible unless they've been propagandized and abused or harmed or whatever. Okay. So obviously there's abuse going on, there's other things, but I think there's another thing. Adults, instead of seeing this vulnerable child as someone to walk them through and help them build a society and get what they really want out of life, they become either tools for their own disordered personal sexual gratification, okay, as we've seen, right, through abuse, or I think, which is increasingly common, just tools for political propaganda. So the child who's emotionally vulnerable is now an opportunity for me as the technocrat to forward and advance my own political agenda at the expense of this child. And then I relegate that person to deep unhappiness. But that's okay. Here's your cell phone. Here's your movies. And, maybe we'll have a universal basic income and you'll be fine. And so I like the way you've talked about this failure of society. And the failure of society is a failure of manliness, ultimately, right? Of adults and women. I mean, for the record, right? Men and women have failed to take responsibility. So I think what you're saying, the breakdown of society is exactly right.
Yeah, I think we can put this in one very American pithy phrase. You don't want to die alone. That's what you want out of life. Don't end up dead alone. You don't want somebody to find your body somewhere days afterwards.
Right. With your phone is not a substitution for deep human relationships.
Yeah, I mean, the recipe for not dying alone is not living alone. Yeah. And that means indeed learning to get along with other people and from experience, figuring out what is good in human beings with respect to love of family, with respect to friendship, with respect also to civil and political associations. Yep. As you said, there's a great need for manliness because somebody needs to step out of his private life and worry also about public affairs. Yeah. And put his reputation on the line, look for the respect of his peers to earn it and to guide them with their consent to the kinds of choices that a community has to make. Not everything is an individual choice. Some choices are up for communities. And at that level, of course, we are even more abandoned. That's the psychopathic character of our lives, that things that are very private, like unhappy children, are they transgender, is something else happening to them? This is a private problem for a very small number of people. And yet it's being transformed into somehow the public concern of every American or person on earth. This is psychopathy.
Yes.
A way of hiding the fact that there are hundreds of millions of Americans who are not transgender, but who might be becoming transhuman with or without their consent. Transgender is just a kind of version of this sci-fi ideal of progress. Mm-hmm. It is a humanity constructed by willfulness through techno-medical power. It's not whatever you were brought up with, and it's not how you were born. It's something willed and medically and technologically, including through mutilation or chemical castration or whatever, achieved. And that's a vision of transhumanism. That's a vision of the cyborg future.
Yep.
And that's why it has some kind of spiritual, crazy appeal, even though most people who are sympathetic or pro, whatever they would say, don't have anything to do with it and would never have anything to do. But they see this idea of the radical will, technologically empowered, transforming biology itself. It's one thing to go to the moon, but it's much more radical in another sense to take control over nature, to take control over what even it means to be generative, to be biological, to be male or female.
Right. It's exactly the wrong kind of manliness. I mean, I think it's a mix of the sexual revolution. I think you're right that transgenderism is really a subset of transhumanism. But because it deals with the fundamental questions of human life, of biology, and it's also a fiction, of course, right? You're pretending that you're no longer female. You're pretending you're no longer male. And also, it's, I think, an appropriation of woman, right? So in a sense, this is a thing I'm trying to articulate, but it's influenced by a number of people, including Carl Stern's magnificent book called Flight from Woman. It's great. I'd highly recommend Carl Stern, Flight from Woman. But in a sense, what does a man want? A man wants to have a relationship with a woman. And from that, it should be fruitful, right? And so when a man is in a relationship with a woman and it's fruitful, the woman is nursing the baby. And in a sense, the man, the husband, the father is participating, not by actually nursing, but by being there and being part of this whole nurturing culture or civilization or society that he is, in a sense, in charge to protect, right? Not in a sense, he's in charge to protect. Well, if you've destroyed motherhood and you've destroyed womanhood and women become simply commodities for sexual use, or women are whatever, they've lost, in a sense, any connection to motherhood or family and nurturing, and you have lonely, disordered men who have maybe been abused or other disordered experiences, in a sense, the man appropriates the woman to himself by changing himself, right? By biologically manipulating himself. So that's the way he's going to get the woman, instead of actually an act of like self-donation, vulnerability, etc. And sometimes, as you said, like the disorder is so deep, and the connection between the sexual revolution, between this absolutely free will with this new ontology of the person, that I don't have an essence, I don't have a nature, I'm not a certain kind of being, I'm just existence and will. And then I determine who I am. And of course, because the sexual revolution is so powerful, and I've talked about this before on the podcast, that you determine who you are through your sexual predilection. And then, as it were, the plastic hardens, and that's who you are. That's your identity, right? And all of these things mix together. But I think there is something about it that I've thought, okay, what is this? It's like a combination between like a classical and a Jewish and a Christian view of the person versus a secular view of the person. But really, maybe more precisely, is there's a debate between, or a struggle between, in a sense, embodied, embedded, biological view of the person that is manifested in Judaism, Christianity, in classical civilizations, in different ways, right? And a modern, disembodied, non-biological, transhumanist will of the person. And that seems to be maybe the best. It's not secular versus religion. It's transhuman versus human. What do you think?
I think that is the most urgent question that cuts to the fundamental questions. What does it mean to be human? Are we for it? And why? And it is becoming increasingly obvious that there's a great temptation to say that, first of all, human isn't even real, it's just a delusion. And secondly, we should be against it.
Right.
There's a kind of contradiction in there, but this is a growing view. It's most obvious when people hate everything about the past, but it's not really less real when people don't say, well, I hate the past, everybody was evil, tear down all the statues, burn the buildings, whatever, but instead just don't care. the hysterical people are more dangerous in the near term, but the nice people are more dangerous long term. They're nice because they don't give a damn. Past is nothing to them. But of course, the past is just another way of saying what we know is real about human beings, or the best guess we have. Not everything from the past is true, but that's the real thing that we have to deal with. And we can, however, through niceness, fail to care to deal with it anymore. And we have talked about all these social issues and the intellectual problems they embody, the questions of identity and humanity, questions of love, association, friendship. And this is not a distraction from the science fiction question, much less from the specific problem, where on the one hand, we said Bladerunner is so much about how tyrannical our way of life already is, how we are slaves to technology rather than masters of it, and how it is hurtling us towards a loss of humanity because people are giving up on themselves, on any idea that through their own knowledge and through their own activity and through their own love for each other and care for human things, they can improve their situation or at least defend what's good about what they have. If people give up hope of that and action in that direction, catastrophe has begun. But Dune, you could say, is pitched much further into the future. We should tell our audience that Dune, in fact, assumes that at some point in man's scientific exploration of the universe, the machines became so dangerous to humanity that there was a jihad, a sacred war against the machines in the name of humanity. And the people won, the machines lost, and the result was, in a way, a new dark age. But in another way, at least a lease of life for humanity. People would not sell their souls to algorithms and robots as we might be tempted to do today. But as you say, in this Dune situation, human beings learn to use their human powers, especially their power of memory, but their human moral intellectual powers through the work that otherwise is relegated to machines. And even so, in this situation, it's not an accident that the protagonist, this Paul Atreides fellow, has to get from his father a noble character, to be a public servant, to be a ruler, a shepherd of the sheep who cares for them and would sacrifice his life for them. And from his mother, he gets a very dangerous dark arts that we would call espionage, essentially, manipulation, persuasion, etc. And then he combines this public political power and the private political power that is espionage into something like prophecy. But because that's what's needed, it seemed to director Denis Villeneuve, for anybody to be able to say, we should stand up for humanity. To stand up for humanity is not merely to speak about it. It's not merely to have a jargon or a theory. It also requires saying, well, who is this human being that has it figured out or can get us closer to figuring it out? And hence this protagonist who has the right education from his father and from his mother, and who will then face this radical problem, religion. For people have to have hope, and that hope ultimately means religion, that there's a divine law that guarantees some providence and guarantees that the distinction between the righteous and the wicked matters. That is to say, that grounds justice and our concern with our good. And that's what Dune Part 2 will deal with. Dune Part 1 only introduces it. There are shows of this fact that this very sophisticated fellow can only really go to work once he is among a people is savage and simple, but fanatically religious. And, they're not adversaries of technology. They are not without technology, but they know that technology is supposed to keep them alive and serve them, not master them. And these much simpler people are a much better political situation since they are not corrupt and soft and decadent and secretly desperate, right? What one sees in our society is that behind the arrogance of our smartphones is the despair of our empty lives. You don't see that kind of complexity. It's a very fascinating complexity for an artist, but it's not helpful to live that way. And in Dune, you see a preference against this sophisticated rottenness for rustic simplicity. This desert people who has no doubt that nature is powerful and dangerous and tries to understand what can be understood, done what can be done, and hope in God that it will get better. And That, I think, is supposed to be a way of looking at the human situation with sympathy and trying to understand something good, or trying to find what is good in human nature, that human beings could survive and in a way become noble and look up to the questions of divine law, even in a terrible situation of a desert. We, of course, are in a situation of spiritual desert, not a physical desert, but something very similar to the situation in Dune applies, which I think is what made the director try to tell this story in a way that very beautiful to attract people and to lead them to think, don't you to some extent feel this way? After all, this fellow Paul Atreides, the protagonist, loses his father and all his aristocratic power and feels completely disinherited, dispossessed, betrayed. Don't young American men feel that way? And in a certain way, they are right to feel that way. Everything that was promised has been taken from them. So I think it's supposed to show people that in such a situation, you needn't be desperate, that facing up to this hardship, the eternal hostility of the desert, can make you stronger, that through suffering might come self-knowledge by way of self-mastery. And that's, you could say, sort of like the example of the young man is what Jordan Peterson is talking about all the time. And the great popularity of Jordan Peterson, I think, is also evidence that there are millions of young men in America who desperately want someone to do what their fathers did not do for them and what American society did not do for them. And, he tries to do it with a certain appeal to nobility. The movie as well, being so beautiful and a heroic story, what we call the epic, the story of a hero in a world of heroes or at the end of heroism, that's supposed to inspire not just manliness, but a certain, if not gentility, then nobility. So there's something should rule over manliness that is closer to beauty than it is to violence.
Yeah.
That something is an image or an vision, cinematically, artistic vision of divine law. There's something in this universe that it's part of the universe. The beautiful is immediately recognizable and stunning, it arrests us, but also suggests that it goes beyond. That it's not simply limited to the beautiful person or the beautiful thing we see. Such as there's something beyond. That, of course, would be some kind of divine grace. And I think that's the humanist intention of Denis Villeneuve in Dune, to give people hope, to tell them that the collapse ahead and the struggle ahead is not hopeless, and to give a kind of reason for why it is not hopeless. On the one hand, in the beauty that it points us towards divine grace, and on the other hand, to look to the harsh but real virtues that make people thrive in face of suffering.
A couple of things come out for that. I think one question that's interesting is earlier in our conversation when you talked about kind of the technocrat who wants to colonize Mars, like what are we fighting for? And there's a line in C.S. Lewis, a couple different places where he kind of addresses this question. Like really all politics, all play, he says. Also war, like the reason you go to fight is you fight to protect the hearth. You fight to protect, in a sense, ordinary life. And if you look at a lot of the Western epics, ancient and modern, and even American epics, you and I were talking about Louis L'Amour the other day. I will have to have a podcast on American Westerns and Louis L'Amour. But there's a sense like what the hero is going for against this harsh reality of injustice and brokenness is, in a sense, to create the conditions for ordinary life. And then you take ordinary life for granted, you lose it. If a violent man of power tries to overcome and take too much for himself, if the large corporation or the large rancher or the powerful technocrat, whatever it might be, or in Bladerunner, the Tyrell Corporation in their pyramid has, in a sense, dehumanized everyone and ruined the earth, that the heroic, well, this not so much in Bladerunner, but in a lot of the epics, the heroic man has to, in a sense, fight to regain ordinary life. So I guess one question is, what are we fighting for if ordinary life doesn't matter anymore? And then following on that would say, well, who says ordinary life doesn't matter anymore? I mean, maybe Titus, you and I are just too pessimistic and dark. I mean, there are millions of Americans and Europeans who just want to be left alone and live their life. And maybe they do care for the past, but they don't know how to do it. I guess those are two, in a sense, related questions. What are we fighting for if we're not fighting for ordinary life? I mean, right? The second question is, who says that everything's so bad? You sound like you're just too pessimistic, and I mean, me too, right? How would you respond to that? And then 3, if we're not being pessimistic, why don't people care about ordinary life? Why have we lost the joy of ordinary life? And is there any way to reclaim it?
Yeah, these are very big things. And there's some kind of combination of questions about what is our situation, what a real scientist, a real observer who does not lie to himself, what would he see? On the other hand, how is this good for us? What good does knowledge produce if we understand ourselves? In what way? How will this make us better off? And these are always addressed in some poetic way, in some rhetoric way in the movies, try to give you a vision that is not despairing. In the case of Bladerunner, at the beginning, you have a guy who, like my friend Pete Spiliakos says, Harrison Ford plays a guy who is essentially a slave hunter.
Yeah.
Human beings now use machine slaves, robots that are human or maybe, or what are they? And however, you have to hunt them down. If you have to hunt them down, it tells you something about yourself.
Right. That's why he's drunk. He's drunk all the time.
Exactly. He's a miserable guy because he's forced, he's compelled by other people. His bosses treat him like a machine, and he is forced to do that to others. He has no self-respect, although he has a gun and he has a kind of power over other people. And at the end of it, he's no longer despairing. When he sees his adversary die the death of a mortal being, with fear and regrets, with a kind of steely resolution, a kind of stoicism, he realizes that fear somehow makes you human. It reminds you of how much you have to lose. And also it summons a kind of inner beauty in these characters, that they strive when they realize how bad their situation is. They don't just give up. This guy doesn't just take to the bottle and destroy himself after all. He doesn't long for something more beautiful. And it turns out in the story, he's also capable of love. And even more so in the Villeneuve movies, like we talked about Arrival and Blade Runner and Dune, these new ones. They're very pro-life movies. They're incredibly dedicated to the biologically generative and the spiritually hopeful in life, and therefore to a new eminence of women in movies compared to the men in the original Blade Runner, Harrison Ford. But even in the original, there is this notion that love and beauty are markers, just like fear is, that we are groping towards human nature. You wouldn't be afraid of misery unless you loved life. You wouldn't say, well, I'm horrified of death, unless you thought life, on the other hand, is good.
Right.
It's in a way a disparate thing to realize, but it is fundamentally true and very important. Fear will teach you that you are a human being and you love humanity. So these movies, even at their bleakest, try to force people to face fundamental issues that will awaken them to human concern. And it's double character. On the one hand, we love ourselves. On the other hand, we try to find out what the truth is about our situation. And we always do both of them. And we're never very great at either one. But we do keep trying morally and intellectually to figure out our situation. So these movies are in that sense life-affirming, even though they seem very pessimistic. They're not pessimistic. They're just trying to say in the clearest way, what is the crisis? People feel unhappy. This is a generalized problem. Millions of people hate each other over political matters, over all sorts of other things. Especially, of course, after 2 years of COVID, did we become more reasonable and come together because of the crisis? No, we're much more paralyzed and paradoxically, it seems much more hateful of each other. Being stuck away from one another has not allowed us any forbearance for one another. If anything, we hate and fear each other more. So these are signs that people are deeply disturbed. It's not that some artist created a dark vision or that you and I are pessimistic with our intellectual vocabulary. It's people's lives that create all this drama. This is not foreign to human experience. It is merely a clarification, artistically or intellectually, of human experience that is shared everywhere, or else we wouldn't have so many popular visions of the end of the world. Dystopia, as people say, tyranny, the end of freedom and the end of humanity, is the most popular story there is, it would seem.
Right.
That's deeply disturbing and deeply revealing that even young people are quite unhappy. It's just that they know even less about how to deal with it or what it exactly means. What part of it is the human condition, which is never easy? What part of it is an urgent problem that has to be dealt with now? And so on and so forth. These important distinctions are not available to the young who lack experience. So with the question of pessimism, the artists and the intellectuals are not lying to us, nor are they lying to themselves. That's the whole attempt, to not lie to themselves, to present the predicament as we feel it in our keener moments, but which we hide from much of the time. Mm-hmm. And to get to the other thing you mentioned, why are people not doing more? Why are people not more active or more vocal in their own defense? That, I think, is indeed a great trouble of our times. As we said, there is no real society to speak of. People do not have the associations through which come to a common understanding and say, yep, it's not just me, I'm not crazy. A lot of us have these problems. And they do not have, therefore, through this organization, the possibility of finding leaders they could trust. And when those leaders say it's really, really bad, then everybody else can say, now it's in the open. He had the guts to say it. He has the reputation to back him up. And I'm just happy somebody finally said it. Mm-hmm. We should not be hiding from ourselves. But you need organization and you need leaders. And we don't have that. That the loneliness of the times, it has also this character. It's not merely a private life problem. It's eminently a public life problem. Mm-hmm. Everything around us, including our despots, are weak. And that only makes the unhappiness worse. Of course, this is not something that the movies or the intellectuals can deal with. It's notorious that intellectuals and movies have next to no power in American society. People might be interested, they might be fascinated, they might be fans, they might buy the books, watch the movies, talk about it with their friends, but they can never quite take it seriously in a practical way.
Why is that?
Well, you could say that it's a whole theory of society and the whole theory of art that gets in the way. People expect the art to express the artist, to express a vision, to express a mood, but not to be a teaching about practical life. And of course, that's nonsense. The only reason to be interested in our visionaries, our poets, whether they make movies or anything else, is that they might say what it's like to be human and what's it to you and me. That's the whole point of human concerns, what we could call political concerns in the broad sense, not political in the sense of an election or of partisanship, but political in the sense that we alone as human beings have common concerns, that we talk together about what our problems are. It makes us distinguished from any other being. So the failure to take art as political is typical of our modernity. The more modern we become, the less we show any respect to the things we admire. Sort of saying that, yeah, it's beautiful, yeah, it's fascinating, or it moved me, but I mean, come on. There's a certain absence of hope there. There's a certain absence of daring that comes from, on the one hand, a bad education with respect to art. People are not taught to take art seriously. Mm-hmm. And on the other hand, it comes from fears we have about our society. Even if you were to learn, like let's say that by some strange accident, Denis Villeneuve or anybody else is a real humanist. He really thought about the human problem and is trying to help. So what? Mm-hmm. Surely Jordan Peterson is trying to help. So what? It does nothing. What does that say to me about my life? What am I going to do? What has anybody else done? Is there somebody who could help me? Is there somebody whom I could imitate because he has succeeded? People feel hopeless and helpless. Yeah. And so they think, well, you can at least get escape at the movies. You can enjoy the movies for all the fun they're worth. And you can even enjoy the misery. Misery is, in a certain sense, enjoyable when you can share it with people.
Company.
And yeah, well, misery does love company. Yeah. People want to be pitied. People want to be told, that is to say that their suffering is unjust. Yeah, it's real but undeserved. And that's actually very dangerous. Mm-hmm. It's this aspect of life. Much of people's pleasure in sharing together art is tainted by this self-pity and this helpless hopelessness. And it seems very aesthetic because it's detached from practical knowledge or practical action. But it's crazy. Yeah, precisely for that reason.
It's moodiness that rejects your agency as opposed to...
Yeah.
So a couple of things that come up. One, I think, I've told you about this before. I don't know if you agree with me on it, but I actually liked the last Spider-Man movie a lot because it dealt with a couple of really interesting things. One, it dealt with male friendship in a very positive way. Peter and Ned, they love each other and it's not sexual, right? They will the other person's good. They've got each other's back. They trust each other. They care for each other. It's something that men want. Two, there was a romantic love between Peter and MJ, which is also pure. It's not sexual. I mean, it's romantic and attractive, but it's not the typical rom-com that just like, you fornicate in the first 3 minutes kind of thing. That's not there. It's growing, budding, romantic love. And then 3, and there's a lot going on. I think there's some critiques of trans-humanism. But one of the things that's kind of interesting is at the end, Peter, what he wants is love and friendship. And yet he has to sacrifice that for the good of his friends. And it's actually not his transhuman spider powers, but it's actually his human act of love and human like manliness that in fact is the source of the sacrifice, right? So I think that's an interesting thing because it's in one sense that too, it's super popular. It's touching to people. Okay, but then what does it mean? Can we go from there to think, well, that's what I want. That's what I need to live for. But I think the other problem is we're distracted, not just by phones, but we're distracted by pop music, pop art, pop everything. Everything is distracted. Everything's like sugar, right? And we're just constantly eating, bad sugar in a sense that's just giving us like a shot of distraction. Then when we're quiet, if we're away from our phone and that despair creeps in, okay, what do we do now? And what's the model for ordinary life? And I think you talked about Jordan Peterson. We call him JP3 around here. And JP2 is the Pope at JP1. So that's my son came up with a JP3. So, I should copyright that. All right. So JP3, if you're listening.
All right, I'll help you along with the joke. He's called Peterson, son of Peter. So I think the Catholic Church can claim this one.
There you go. So anyway, but JP3 is an interesting...
And the River Jordan. I mean, it's foreordained almost.
That would be interesting to have a discussion about him because I started listening to his things quite a while ago. Someone put me on to him and I listened to him. And of course, once he became famous, it was all on the pronoun question. It was almost funny to me how ridiculous the commentary was. Like I'd actually listened driving in my car to hours of Jordan Peterson lectures on the Bible and everything. And, I think he makes errors in a number of ways. And, I think he's a little too enthusiastic of Joachim Fiora and other things. But anyway, I liked him. I listened to him. I thought he was great. And then, he got big on the pronoun stuff and everybody said, oh, this guy is like behind angry white men and everything. And I thought like, yeah, you've never listened to him, so, I'm married happily. Thanks be to God. I married well. I don't know if my wife married well. I always tell her that I don't deserve her and she doesn't deserve me, and with not the same use of the meaning of deserve. But anyway, I've got a lot of children and I have friends and an interesting job I like. And I like Jordan Peterson. I was challenged by Jordan Peterson or JP3. And I thought, okay, that's good. I learned from him. And I know other people, I have relatives and friends who are doing well. And they also were challenged by JP3 to do better. And there was something about the fact that he says, always tell the truth, at least don't lie. There's a dragon under your bed that's causing anxiety. You better figure out what it is because it's just going to grow. And he's actually really, dealing in a sense, he's both new and old. A priest who's a friend of mine said, the song I know, the singer is new, right? Peterson is, I think, very valuable. And, he's got his faults and et cetera. But what's interesting about this that I wanted to get to, that with my long preface, is how the elites, and we can define what we mean by the elites, but essentially like the dominant forces, just opposed him and caricatured him. And so in one sense, you would want someone like Peterson to tell men, work hard, clean your room, stop trying to solve global problems when you're just, a jerk, stop being a jerk, treat men well, treat women well, build friendships. Okay. And yeah, is there some disorder in Peterson? Sure. We could talk about that. But what I want to say is, we all have errors, but generally speaking, this is a positive force for our time. And yet in a sense, the establishment vitriol towards Peterson from men and women, okay, that didn't listen to his stuff. And in fact, almost were resentful of the fact that he was helping 25 and 30-year-old men get their lives together. Like, why, Titus? Why do you think that is? Because in a sense, he kind of did what the science fiction films that we're talking about did, is he brought reality to you. Your life's messed up. You're messed up. There's a technocracy. There's forces. There's nature is trying to get you. And that's the role of the human man and human woman to say, okay, what am I going to do? And you have agency in the face of tragedy and randomness, but you have agency. And he was hated. Why?
Well, I think it's because primarily our elites have decided to hate the people they rule. We are in a strange situation. The elites are always complaining about ordinary people. They're always trying to say that ordinary people are dangerously deluded, or they're dangerous just because they're evil. These are governing elites that no longer want to govern, just to punish. They are not the arrogant liberals of the 90s. These people are agonized, despairing. They have drama in their lives, and they will tell you, if you care to listen, about all their mental illness. They brag about it because it proves how moral they are, because the world broke them. The world made them suffer. They're all crazy because Trump showed up. It's not that they were crazy and then Trump showed up and then they had the chance to show it. It just started then. They were pure before that. Or the patriarchy made them unhappy, or racism made them unhappy, as though that explains why they are hysterical and psychotic. These are the elites we have, and there is no changing them. There's only dealing with them. And Jordan Peterson came along and acted as though, well, no, you can't blame the society for the way the government deals with things. But what are you going to do? He's this one guy. He can't fix the government. He can't fix the elites. There's no way he can get a job, much less change what is taught in an elite university. So instead, he thought, well, you can talk directly to the young men. Life is messed up, and you should get control of yourself. You might not be able to control more than that, but control this much. It's a kind of stoicism that men always need. It's not necessarily useful. It might lead people to blame themselves or to keep their heads down. After all, stoicism is if you allow me a joke, the philosophy famously of one emperor and one slave. So it's very strange. Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus.
Epictetus, yeah. That's fun. One emperor, one slave, yeah. And Cicero, yeah.
That's a different kind of stoicism. Yeah. But if we had a Ciceronian stoicism, America would be in great shape. So there's something dangerous to this teaching that tells people just mind your own business, as though the rest of the world doesn't exist. But I believe all in all, Jordan Peterson did a lot of good for a lot of people, because it was the first kind of self-help that told people you should take some responsibility over yourself. Are you unhappy? You might be the problem. You should deal with yourself more seriously. You should not think of yourself as a victim. Better to be the perpetrator of your unhappiness, which you can then change with the proper teaching and encouragement, than to believe you are the victim of the cosmos or of society, because there's nothing you can do about that.
Right.
And this notion, blame yourself. Yes, it's a messed up world, but blame yourself, because it's the only way you will have any agency.
Well, and I think too, the other thing you think he did.
Very good.
Yeah, I think, again, I want caveats, because I think there's some, things that Peterson had, there's some weakness there. But I think the other thing he did that was really very good. I mean, let me stop for a second. I'm not just trying to be like pedantic. I think there's a little bit kind of over focus on Jungianism. I think he goes too down into the abyss. I don't think he takes seriously certain elements that you can learn from the church fathers and the church doctors, who are masters of the spiritual life and masters of the psychological life. I'm not trying to just like go away like, well, I want to distance myself from Peterson. I'm not doing that. So I think he was like super helpful. Let me just be clear, because I didn't want to sound like, well, I won't like Peterson too much so that people, the elites won't like me. I don't have friends to lose, so I'm okay with that. But what I want to say, though, is what I also think he did that was really important is he talked about the past. Like, he read through the Bible, okay? And he got people to think about the past. And I think that was another element. So it was about agency, about the past, and about the person as embedded in a society. I think those things help people. And, I think a lot of men, young men especially, and women found it helpful. So you can comment more on Peterson, but let me move to another thing that I'm a little bit worried about, and then maybe we can end, and I'll have you back on the show for another time. But which I think connects back to our science fiction thing. So feel free to make your comment on Peterson, but let me just ask this question before I forget, which is, here's my worry. You talked about stoicism. I think along with Peterson, there's another set of people who are also trying to get people to think about agency. It's a certain entrepreneurial mindset. You have this sense of like kind of the heroic entrepreneur, the tech guy, the sovereign individual, right? This book, The Sovereign Individual, which inspires a lot of, kind of crypto, et cetera. And I think of people like Tim Ferriss as kind of a model of this. I mean, Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Workweek, whatever, like very helpful. I learned things from it. I've enjoyed some of Ferriss's podcasts. But at the bottom, I have to say, as a critique, I don't know him personally, so this is not a personal critique. But I mean, he's in a sense a transhumanist, right? He's a certain kind of like materialist stoic who, if you follow Ferris to where you're going, where you measure everything and everything, you objectify yourself, you objectify others, you objectify women, you objectify the world in a sense to like control the world. And I think a lot of young men are also going in that direction. Like there's something attractive about kind of modern American stoicism that meets together with transhumanism and gives you powerful agency, but it doesn't deal with the fundamental thing you need to be a man and woman, which is self-donative love, right? Which is tenderness. And so I've talked about this before in the podcast, but I think Wojtyła and George Orwell in 1984 and Wojtyła in Love and Responsibility, that's John Paul II, deal with this question of tenderness is one of the key responses and resistance to totalitarianism. And I would say that my worry, different from this, is I'm shifting off of Jordan Peterson of JP3 to like kind of this modern stoic, Tim Ferriss, sovereign individual, Elon Musk, vision of the heroic entrepreneur who makes himself is still a cyborg transhumanist problem. And it's attractive to men because it gives them the hint of agency, because it's true. There is agency there, but it doesn't satisfy because it doesn't give you actually what you really want, which is deep, loving relationships of the ordinary life that we so have to despise. What do you think about that? Are my fears right, wrong?
I think that's largely true. And, these are screwed up people, but American society requires that, right? If people want entertainment, that means that there's going to have to be a lot of crazy 20-something girls and boys who are obsessively pretty and go to Hollywood to waste their souls. Because people want the content. And if you want new apps, then that means that there's got to be a lot of teenager and 20-something boys who hate themselves. Because in America, you have sports in college and in high school, and there's no state that cares about things as they care about sports. That's the passion. That's the stuff. Coaches are heroes. And that leaves mathematic kids feeling very miserable and dishonored from the get-go, because they can't play football or baseball, much less be a triathlete. And that leads all these desperate young men to Silicon Valley. And so long as America wants apps, they will sell their souls for apps. Somebody has to do the coding, somebody has to do the startups, and these desperate people will do it. And of course, they want some sense of completeness. They want, in a certain moral sense, to be beautiful. The actors and actresses embrace all these stupid liberal causes because they seem so beautiful. Justice for the world. Adopt a third world baby. Do something. Right. As the beautiful always promises completeness, perfection. So with these guys, be a stoic, be the complete man. Turn yourself into a robot and your home into a lab. That's what Tim Ferriss does. He will say it out loud. I am turning my home into a laboratory. Man was not made to live in a laboratory, and in certain important ways, he is not human. I'm sure there are many people who admire him. Many reasonable people will feel sorry for him or look on him with distaste. But them's the breaks. It's not human to make a laboratory of your life. You cannot live that way.
I think I would say, I think you feel sorry because you're like missing, and then you feel worried that this is the model for young men. It's not the model.
Yes, but there is no model that offers young men manliness. And there's nothing on offer for that. And so, they will go with this nonsense because it's the only thing available. Because young men too believe in science, right? Put it this way, our manliness is nothing but scientific cyborgs. America's athletes are creatures of science, not of American manliness. They are supposed to be on, hot when they're hot and on ice when they're iced, and they are supposed to be treated in this way and treated in that way, in a scientific way, so that their bodies can play tough sports at the age of 40. And that's science. It's science that figures out what kind of armor they need to protect themselves and what kind of research is necessary so that they know how to hit better. And of course, American soldiers, the special forces are creatures of technology. They are full of gear. That's what makes them what they are. And there is always great danger that from the geek in Silicon Valley to the super trooper out there fighting where his country doesn't even know he exists, they're all creatures of technology. They all have standard operating procedures and they all have ideals that are measured and improved, and they all believe in iteration. It's the way people execute in a post-political and in a way post-human world. There is something deeply screwed up with all this, of course. None of these people are really alive to poetry. They do not know what sings to their souls. And that is, again, what society has done to them since they were young. It's tough, but it's true. And of course, you're right. The capitalist ethos has transformed. Everybody in the 90s were still busy reading Machiavelli's Prince. And the next generation, they're all busy reading Marcus Aurelius.
Right.
But, they're not that different. The presentation is very, very different. It's not the 80s or the 90s Machiavelli. It's the teens and 20s Marcus Aurelius. And in a way, the rapacity of Machiavelli and the moral sternness of Marcus Aurelius are the opposite. But not in all the ways, and certainly not the ones that are relevant to this heroic ethos of capitalism, because they're all about control and self-control of a certain kind, and even deception. So I'm not myself pleased with this transformation. It's not surprising that once capitalism came under fire from the elites and it became morally damned, there was always going to be a need to defend it somehow, as moralistic, and Stoicism can offer that moralistic defense, just like capitalists can speak about their social responsibility and their woke ideals, but they're not real. And the problem is that these people are themselves not real. They're not really the leaders that those organizations need or that American society needs. They've got a kind of authority. They've got power because everybody else is confused, but they're not really leaders and they're not really men. And, it's inevitable that we will live out this problem. So there's always a question about how can you do something about it? How can you do something else than be critical? Being critical is very helpful when you can disillusion people so they don't do crazy stuff.
Right.
That's very helpful.
But what do you do, though?
It would be helpful if there were people who could be persuaded to study and to use digital technology in line with things that are already known to be good for human beings, with our various traditions as they are available to people intellectually, politically, socially, religiously. That would be something much likelier to succeed. And then further than that, it would be useful if people got in the business of taking poetics and rhetoric seriously as an appeal simultaneously to the ordinary audience and the aspiring leaders. There's no other way to form new elites. One thing that people should learn from this criticism is that the ideas that got us into this mess are not going to get us out of it.
Right.
It's not that everything is wrong with us or that our lives are terrible. It's that we're miserable for very good reasons. But we might be able to deal with this if we called on more serious resources. And it's, I think, obvious, even to ordinary people, that our elites are uneducated in the fundamental sense. They do not know anything important about being human.
Unfortunately,
they had to start working when they were young, whether they're tech fanatics or actors for that matter. And they had to play a social role of that kind since their teenage years. There was never any time for them to learn. And that is a deep problem. Elites should have what is called a liberal education or a classical education. That is to say, they should have a way to raise the question, what does it mean to be human? What is the justice that binds a community? What is the happiness at which every human being aims? What does it mean to long for God? If you do not understand these things, you're not going to understand other people. And you can see how being blind, as people say today, autistic, we have a new name for selfishness. It's called autism. And then it's typical of our times, right? To say that I'm autistic is different from saying I'm selfish because, first of all, it's a medical condition, so that's science, it's not morality. And second of all, it's a problem I'm confessing to. I'm autistic. It's some kind of problem, some kind of disability. And therefore, you shouldn't judge me, you should pity me. But when the autists turn out to be billionaires, who the hell is going to go around pitying them? But they are not really human when they exercise these kinds of powers from a massive tech corporation and dehumanize us in the process. Facebook is not fit for human beings, and that is proof enough that there's something deeply wrong with Mark Zuckerberg. I don't know if anybody can fix this, and I have no particular interest in that. But I do have an interest in the people who are deformed spiritually and whose education is ruined by silly people like him. From a certain point of view, he's a child. He has not learned what it means to be an adult. And presumably that has to do with the strange ambitions he has managed to live up to. But the result, it ain't great. And there's a reason America is not uniformly happy and grateful. There's a reason people do not write songs of love or admiration for Mark Zuckerberg or just thank him. There's a reason he's hated. Not, I don't mean politically over the 2016 elections or for censoring President Trump, on the other hand, in 2020. I don't mean partisan stuff. I mean, Americans don't like this guy. And that is a very telling thing. The fact that we do not have popular leaders is something that a poet or an orator would immediately seize upon to show that we are deeply in trouble as a community. You can't say we are free and then we end up with some leaders and we don't like any of them. Soon we will not elect our leaders or will not have freedom anymore in some other way if this goes on. We should like our leaders well enough. Some of these people we should admire, or else what is it that we are trying to tell our kids to be?
Mm-hmm. And I think that also breeds a cynicism, right? Because there's no one to admire. There's no one to admire.
Exactly.
Who do you really want to be like, right? And this is where film and stories become so very important. So we need to finish off. I'm so grateful for your time. I'd love to have you back on. We can talk about Stoicism. I just think, it's even going to get worse because with the aspirations of genetic manipulation through the CRISPR technology, and there's going to be, some amazing things, like they've already done trials to fix sickle cell anemia. This whole idea, we've already seen the dangers of embryonic research on using gene therapy. There's a Chinese scientist who did it to remove, basically make two twin girls who were born resistant to AIDS. Well, now we think about this kind of Bladerunner, and, this is very dark, but some of the replicants were made to basically they were called leisure. They were basically made to be sex slaves. And so think about what happens when we're trying to create human beings. And this is the aspiration of people. Okay, this is not so far off in the future. I mean, obviously there's going to be, off-target effects and lots of problems. But I mean, a scientist in China already did it with twin embryos. The girls are born, and so they can't get AIDS. Now maybe they're never going to be allowed to reproduce because the Chinese government won't let them do that because it was germline editing. Or now think about it. What if they're also made to not be able to get syphilis and gonorrhea? Now, what are they made for? They're sterile kind of, transhuman creatures that are used for other people, right? And we see this again, even with embryonic selection, where you're trying to find a donor for another child, right? So that all the embryos are destroyed except the one who's used for a donor. This stuff is real. There's a rabbi I sometimes listen to. His name is Asher Crisp. And I had a phone call with him once, very interesting guy. I've watched some of his little talks about what's going on in science. And he said, it's going to make you want to run for the hills. Right. And I think this goes, we can open this door to talk later, but I think this goes to part of why the science fiction genre and these films that we've talked about are so important. These things are in our face. And so in one sense, we want to put our head in the sand and just pretend like they're not there. And we're trying to grasp for ordinary life. And we don't exactly know how to do that. There's not the models. We don't have a poetic education. Again, Carl Stern's Flight from Woman has a beautiful chapter on the difference between scientific and poetic knowledge. We've lost the poetic knowledge. Ian McGilchrist's book, The Master and His Emissary, deals with this part where we're physiologically, neurologically deformed, as it were. And so this is just going to get worse as we move further into transhumanism. And I think maybe we could have you back and talk more about transhumanism, but let me maybe finish with this. You're a film critic and a literary critic. And one of the ways that we see this kind of dystopian move that's revealed, it makes us try to face our humanity and then do something about it. So what would you say after all this discussion, which is pretty dark and despairing? What has worked for you? What has helped you get a vision so that you don't feel that you're simply a cog in a technocratic machine? Not that you're not struggling with it, but I mean, I'm older than you are. I had some models. I modeled my father and other men, and I was blessed with good friends, and I'm blessed with a lovely wife. And I had a certain attachment to certain poetry, even though I was poorly educated. I was able to get that a little bit later. How do we do that? What worked for you? And how do we get people to be opened up to both the deeper mysteries, beauties, transcendent of life, and by doing that, open them up to, in a sense, the wonder of the ordinary?
Primarily, I recommend friendship. When I was a kid, there were movies, books we read, and we talked about things. I was lucky enough to have friends. Some people, because of their situation, might not easily make friends. Indeed, in some cases, it may be difficult. In my case, it was not. And talking about things to see that somebody else also loves them, and not just that you love my favorite song, but to learn what are these things saying, why. How does this movie or this song make you feel? Why? What does this novelist try to bring out of you? Why is that important? That is to say, it's a combination of intelligence and humanity. You have to try hard to use your brains and to learn how to interpret, but also you have to have a human concern to say that this artist, that's why I don't despair. I see these artists, their movies, and I see what they are trying to do, and I understand that, like me, they believe in the quest for understanding of human nature, and that it's somehow good. If they're not despairing and they make these dark movies, certainly I have no reason to despair myself. Wherever you see people who have the requisite intelligence and sensitivity, you see people striving to make mankind human, not transhuman, not post-human, not to improve necessarily, but just to be human enough to understand our problems and to try to deal with them rather than make it worse by pretending on the one hand we don't have problems, and on the other hand, the problems are insuperable anyway, so we might just abandon our humanity instead. The serious study is study of human things. It's a study of knowledge as self-knowledge. What kinds of human beings are there? Why do they do what they do? What does that point to in terms of learning, in terms of morality, in terms of justice? These are concerns that people have been denied for a long time, partly because it was pretended that the problems were solved, partly because it was claimed that the problems only belonged to a narrow elite that will do social science on them. And that's a soulless attitude. I always give as an example the man because of whom I write for American magazines, my mentor, the late Peter Lawler, who was a Southerner, he was a gentleman, he was a pious Catholic, and he was a very serious scholar of Tocqueville and of other things, and he was a college professor all his life. It's what he believed in, talking to young people about America and humanity and seeing them make something of themselves through the benefits of the education in the college in Rome, Georgia. And he was forever worried about what he called the creepy and creeping libertarianism of technocrats. He was forever warning us about the liberal libertarian convergence. Yep. He always looked to science fiction movies to show what do the artists say our crazy people are doing and what it might do to us if we allow it to happen. And so I found it very easy to learn from him. We share the same concerns about man and God in America, about Tocquevillian studies. And it was very easy for me to pick up from him and to try to further his chosen path, the postmodern conservative path. He said we have to be postmodern, rightly understood. We have to accept what's good about modernity, but not what's bad. And to be postmodern then is to learn from the pre-mod, to learn that ancient and medieval thinkers and writers of various kinds also had deep insights that are now urgently necessary for us. For people who have intellectual ambitions, there is nothing that competes with reading ancient or medieval books, because those people lived very differently, and it is a real challenge to understand human nature through these great writers when we cannot appeal to our urgent concerns or our selfishness or our blindness. Peter Lawler said that to be postmodern is to try to fix our problems without being arrogant. And modernity did a lot of good, but also created a lot of catastrophes, and we shouldn't be arrogant about that.
Yeah.
It's one of these funny problems that we always say it's such a great thing science gave us a vaccine, but we don't say it's such a great thing that the science gave us the disease or the science gave us the drugs. Who gave us those drugs that are killing all these desperate young men? The science gave us those drugs too. These things didn't grow up a mountain. They were synthesized in a laboratory.
Fentanyl in this case,
fentanyl, OxyContin. These things didn't grow up a mountain. So science did that too. Science is not necessarily good for us. We should not be slaves to it.
Right.
We should see the good in it and worry about the bad, and therefore become aware that we as human beings have some knowledge of good and evil that doesn't depend on technological advancement.
Yes.
Instead, technological advancement depends on it.
Yes, exactly.
And Peter Lawler did a lot for my growing up as a writer, to be serious and humane, to always care about helping other people if I understand something that can be helpful to people. So I could not let this occasion pass without remembering him. He was a great American, and I hope an inspiration to many other people too.
Yeah, well, that's wonderful. No, I think a couple of things. One is it's very important to have gratitude. I want to say, generally, I was thinking the other day about, I'm going to try to create a gratitude map. I'm probably right about this, where go through your life and think of all the people who are your benefactors, who guided you. And maybe even a little thing who, like, in a sense, if you hadn't met them, where would you, a little turn here and there, and have this gratitude. And then even sometimes maybe someone who you have some gratitude and some anger towards, right? But realizing that too is something to reflect on. So I think I'm glad you just brought that importance of gratitude to our mentors. I think I too am so grateful that I've had some teachers in my life who helped clear up my thinking, who told me I was stupid, gently, but they told me I was stupid and helped me clear up. So I think that's important. On Peter Lawler specifically, I actually had a chance to meet Peter Lawler. We did a conference together, and I always got a kick out of the fact that he would sit there and he would say something and he'd be talking and they'd say, but, with his long but, and then go into the next thing. And it was great. And I think that there was something grounded about him. I didn't know him, but worked one conference. We worked one seminar together, and it was good to meet him. But I think you also hit on a couple of other things just to touch on. I mean, reading the ancient text, C.S. Lewis, the great C.S. Lewis, says, for every new book you read, you should read 2 old books. He also makes a very important point about friendship that you made in the beginning. It's friendship is something where people share something together. And then in that sharing of something that they love together, they actually can grow in intersubjectivity. And then they grow in this friendship, which is to seek the good of the other, which is real love, right? And that's why, by the way, subjectivism is so poisonous, or one of the reasons why. Because if you and I are talking about a movie or a song, and you tell me what you got out of it, and I tell you what I got out of it, but it's just in the eye of the beholder, and there's no place for us to fight and argue, not only is that boring, but it denies our deepest human experiences, our unique unrepeatability that we bring to a piece of art, piece of literature, a landscape, an experience. And instead of being able to share and grow in intersubjectivity, right, where we see each other as a subject, we're just kind of left into this kind of banal feelings of, well, my own views. And that too is nihilistic, right? It breaks down friendship. It's nihilism. And then the other thing I think that's just so very important and so much a theme throughout this entire conversation of science fiction is the great Alexis de Tocqueville, right? And the problem of what it means to be a human being in this new science of politics, of democracy. What does it mean to be an individual in an individualist culture, and how individualism leads to centralization, and how centralization and the elites, then we could say in that language of today, want to encourage individualism. And then how technology comes in and exacerbates our individualist inward turning. And so that, in a sense, this friendship and community, and then a love of the past and a prudence that is to see the world as it is and act accordingly. And what great literature and great film gives us is the ability, in a sense, to escape from the banality of ourselves into the harsh reality of the world in which we live in, but with a sense of agency and hope, as opposed to the distraction of modern pop culture and then the false promise of transhumanism. I mean, I don't know if that articulates kind of what we were talking about throughout, but that seems to be the value of good science fiction and good literature, good dystopian fiction. Is it's rough, it's a tough situation, but there is some agency. And guess what? It's not simply a technical solution. It has to be a human solution. And the opposite is much easier. Be distracted and then use yourself as a lab and see if we can just get beyond this horrible humanity and this kind of gross biological creature that we are. Those are the two options. And I say, I opt for reality and biology and agency and the past and the future, rather than this kind of transhumanist, post-humanist element. And that's, in one sense, what I'm getting from learning from you and from the science fiction films, that you've got to go through that short-term despair for long-term hope, as opposed to distraction from despair to a false hope in progress.
Yeah, I think you put it beautifully. Science fiction is there to teach us properly that we hope for too much from science and not enough from ourselves, to say nothing of each other and God. and that we need to face this kind of suffering you get through a story. It's not the same thing as losing someone. It's a specific kind of suffering, contemplating the human drama that we got ourselves into this mess and science is not going to get us out of it.
Right.
We cannot escape that there's technology everywhere, but we cannot escape the problem of it either, to not give it any thought or to assume it takes care of itself or it's just our servant.
That just interrupt. Technology is somehow external for man. I mean, man is the creator of technology. It's part of our nature that we have techne, we create things. And so then that's in a sense, the radical separation that somehow technology is this like Hegelian force, as opposed to human beings have to make decisions. And that's why you can never separate the fact that you can do something from whether you ought to do something or not. And I think that's, by the way, the great critique of technology in Benedict XVI's Spe Salvi. But I jumped in, but I think that's the other thing. It's almost like a reification of technology. It's like something that's its own thing, right? Not that it doesn't actually have effects on us, but that it is always connected to the human.
Yeah, exactly. But it shows up as a concern for us. We reify it as in the stories. You see these pyramids in Bladerunner. You see all this technology in Dune. It's part of our experience. But you're right. It is not the ultimate way of looking at a human being, which has to include human making. It's just the way it strikes us now, because whenever we stop to look, we realize suddenly everything around us is made. We don't notice that every day. Nobody goes around and says, this street, we made it. Somebody made it. I don't know who, but it was made by people. And you know what? If I think about it for a minute, there's another city from 100 years ago under it.
Right.
It's just built on top of that. We don't, it takes a shock to realize these things. And that's what science fiction tries to provide, that shock that gives you clarity. Finally, you see this. And then, as you say, you have to somehow figure out, how does this lead to a vision of hope and salvation? How does this lead us, that is to say, to our properly human concern with our own good and our own being? It's not great that we start in a very gloomy place with our social and political drama, with our tech drama, with our science fiction and the living science fiction we live with. But it is there, and it is the part of any serious person to look around, look ahead. Hopefully, when it is done through movies, it's easier to bear. It's all fictional. You don't have to panic. You don't have to despair. It's not saying like, oh my God, I have no life. It's a story. And that means that it's easier to get clarity. It's easier to see something and therefore to begin the process of thinking. These artists are your friends. The writers are your friends. They're trying to say, look at this. This is where you should begin. If you have this experience, think about what this shows you and move on with your own thinking about it, with your own conversations with your friends and everybody else, your politicians and your priests and so on. They are your friends, and we are all desperately in need of friends.
Yep.
The good news is that even these dark movies are usually made by people with deep humanistic convictions that lead them to say, we have to try and help people. We have to show them what we have seen and guide them as best we can within these limits of a story, right? None of these people makes a big movie and then says, now vote me into office or let's do a cult. They're not crazy people. They understand. They're just storytellers. They can teach something, but not everything.
Yeah.
But they do offer something needful now. And I think also this kind of hope that there are ways to show what you have learned to millions of other people so that everybody gets a better beginning point or a new opportunity to think harder and to be more serious about being human. And these are all reasons of hope.
Yep.
Even in this dark stuff, we find hope because it makes sense and it is guided by a humanistic intention to help people.
Right.
So it's very good to have that.
Yeah.
It's the best we can do to spread news of that. It's what we can, it's the least we can do. It's not the most we can do, but it is the least we can do to help each other and help other people.
Good. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. I appreciate your time. I know it's getting late there where you are in Prague. So I appreciate you coming on. I hope you come back again. There's Tocqueville to talk about. There's Peter Lawler to talk about. There's Westerns and Louis L'Amour. But thank you very much for joining. And maybe just quickly, any recommendation of those 3 films, any other science fiction just films you think are so important to watch that we could leave the audience, the listeners with?
Yeah, of course. First, let me thank you for the invitation. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Michael, and a pleasure to do podcasts as well. Let me leave you with 2 recommendations from the late 90s. One of them is called Gattaca, for the DNA sequences, GTC, of course, and A. And the other one is called Truman Show. Gattaca is about taking genetic control, and it's a kind of neo-noir. It's a retrofuturistic. It's a future that looks like the 50s, but people have space travel and incredible genetic control. And it's an attempt to rescue humanity from a situation where your fate is determined before you are born through scientific control. And of course, the influence it has over everybody's opinion. Your mother and your father will look at you differently because they have certain certainties that come from this scientific control given to them by a doctor. It's a great movie. I recommend it. It stars Ethan Hawke and Jude Law. Uma Thurman is in it, and the secondary cast is also really good. So watch that. It's better than anything made about the bio aspect of our scary potential for tyranny now. And the other one, Truman Show, is about what we call social construction of reality, or reality TV. It stars a fellow whose life is fake. It's a TV show for everybody else to enjoy. My contention is that many people, most people perhaps, are tempted at least to turn into that, a fake life that is on display, streaming all the time. It was a very prophetic movie. This was at the beginning of reality TV. At that, it was not an everyday reality, much less was there any online streaming. But it's a very good show, again, of what it might mean for people to abandon life and to have a fantasy of life that comes to them through the TV. That's very good pictures, well written, well acted, and also, as people like to say, ahead of their time. But as people who respect poets say, they were visionaries. They saw what was already happening, and they just showed you what it would lead to. I think this, again, is a good sign that our poets are underrated. The talented ones can smell what's coming in the wind and can warn the rest of us if we listen and take this seriously. So hard to beat movies that are also enjoyable and very artful, but retain the insight and the humanistic intention. So watch Gattaca, watch The Truman Show. You'll love them. All right, Michael, all the best.
All right, thanks, Titus. So, and I'll put up links where everybody can find you and your work at the American Cinema Foundation. Thanks again for joining the Moral Imagination.
Thank you. Bye-bye.